went through another interesting process, a positive Chiefs season. I've been able to announce that I'll be welcoming my second child this summer. My wife and I are expecting in mid-June. Thank you. And by the way, for those of you who are parents of multiple children, I've appreciated the honesty because many have told me, I've said, does it get easier? And they say, no, not really. It just changes just a little bit along the way. But we have also seen consistent challenges in Kansas City. Gun violence, something of which we are too aware, recognizing a shooting on the Country Club Plaza last night where no one was hit, but where once again our community wonders how we can stop. We continue to face challenges with homelessness, immigration, and a new and larger international conversation that impacts, I think, more people than we would have imagined. And that concerns the situation in Gaza and in the Middle East. We'll talk about all of those in turn. So first, I want to talk about what we did this last year. What are those objective basics in Kansas City that we continue to work on? Well, my friends, while we all recognize that potholes and road concerns remain an issue, we have continued to quadruple the funding in road repair in Kansas City, making sure that ultimately, even though you won't feel it on Main Street if you drove it in today, we'll have smoother drives and ultimately long-term more stable streets. You see that as well in how we handle things such as snowplow removal, and I promise we've gotten better even though the good Lord has blessed us with not much need anymore for snowplow work. And so on those core basics, we're doing a lot. But something that no mayor ever comes to you and talks about, and perhaps, Joe, it's the freedom of a second term, is the fact that some of these issues are ones that we need to have a deeper conversation about. If we are a city that is as spread out as we are, with 6,000 lane miles, with 319 square miles of a city, we have to decide when is building too much infrastructure, too many giant roads, doing too much of the expansive manifest destiny type work, when is it too much? When I was a city councilman in 2017, and thank you to the voters, we approved a general obligation bond. The goal that was discussed at that time, and certainly one that folks like myself and Councilwoman Catherine Shields and others had mentioned, was that we wouldn't build any new roads with that investment. Instead, it would be on things like road repair for roads that had been decaying for years and years, particularly in urban Kansas City and in East Kansas City. Unfortunately, what did we do immediately after? We started building new 4- and 6-lane roads on the edges of our city, saying that this is the way that we can truly develop long-term. It is not. One of the more interesting things when I'm actually in the Northland portion of the city, this isn't a south of the river versus north conversation, but you talk to people who drive on streets like North Oak and Vivian Road and so many roads where we haven't invested for generations, and they say, help us fix what is here today. Help us improve our core of the city, the core of the Northland portions of the city. Don't just continue to think that the future is leapfrog development forever and forever. What we need to say in Kansas City and in every American city is that ongoing suburbanization, leapfrog development, anti-pedestrian development is something that long-term does a disservice to our city. It has been amazing to watch that people love the streetcar. Perhaps some of you may even remember when the streetcar was last here in existence. It's amazing that we go back to making some of the same mistakes again and again, and then we say, wait a minute, it actually worked before. If our children have the opportunity to walk to good activities, if we believe in good density, in shopping districts that welcome people of all ages, we are building long-term a better city. And that's the Kansas City that we need to work on and continue to work on in the year ahead. Between now and the next time I visit with you, a year from now, we hope to have the streetcar open through Main Street and down to UMKC, which is going to be very exciting. But there's also something that's very exciting to me. Recently, we had the chance to celebrate the opening of the new Canadian Pacific Kansas City CPKC Stadium, home of our professional women's soccer team, the Kansas City Current. Something that is an incredible thrill, not just for women and girls, but I think for families and all of us in Kansas City. There are so many great things to mention, and I'll just mention a few, but one of the things relating to our transit discussion that I think about all the time with it is how many families, my own included, have said, and I've heard say, how neat that we can hop on a streetcar, get to a women's soccer stadium, shop in the city market, head home, see more of our communities, be part of truly a united Kansas City. And by the way, get out of our own personal vehicles, see people who look different, who worship differently, who may be different in any number of ways, but we get to have that wonderful crossroads of life that is an American city. That is development done right. That is Kansas City done right. And so as I think about the KC Current, and I allow this to be a transition from our infrastructure and transportation conversation, I think about one of my biggest goals. Now, often I try to be an optimist. And being an optimist in today's America and in today's world, I think, is incredibly important. As a reminder to you, and I've had a lot of people share with me a lot of things in the last week or so. When I was elected mayor in 2019, chief success has always been a part of my time. I guess I told my wife once, actually she told me, often when I'll be at places, people always say, what's the greatest thing you've done? And I say, the Chiefs have won 3 Super Bowls. And she'll usually nudge me and say, you didn't catch any passes or throw any balls. But I'm like, but I sure did shout. But as I've gone through that time, immediately after that first Super Bowl win in 2020, what we saw was a global pandemic, protests, and so many other challenges. And occasionally, and there are good people who come to me and say, how do you handle different burdens or different issues each day? And at one point, I recall during the fall of 2020, I had a Facebook group that was calling for my recall because I supported mask rules and ways that we tried to save the lives of so many others. At a certain point, that group reached 13,000 people. Most of them non-Kansas Citians, a lot of people who were just making noise, but 13,000 folks. So if I just have a few people jawing at me day to day, I never tend to matter that much, never tend to mind. But as I think about what we do and what we are doing, I think about in Kansas City how hard it is and how much we work in Missouri and in Kansas and where we sit in our country to be welcoming. I am proud that Kansas City is a welcoming city, and we will forever be a place that is a welcoming city. When I went to the home opener for the Kansas City Current, I got to see lots of women and girls smiling. I saw gay and lesbian Kansas Cityans, transgendered Kansas Cityans, folks who never felt like they were truly accepted in any sporting venue. This was not a place where they were saying the girls need to be somewhere else, where they need to be in the back, where they just need to cheer. This was not a place where we were objectifying women. This was not a place where we were saying you need to be marginalized. This was a place where we were saying women are central, are cool, and frankly, are building the most exciting sporting environment, the new sporting environment in Kansas City that we have seen in generations. That was a thrill for me. It was a thrill for me to take my son there and say, yeah, this is Kansas City at its best. And it is a thrill for me to tell generations of Kansas Cityans, hopefully future ones, that when you think of the Midwest, it isn't that you have to go somewhere else to feel acceptance. You can find acceptance in your true self here. Some years ago, I was teaching law at the University of Kansas. I continue to. They allow me to teach a course by the name of local government law, which, I know a thing or two about. And I had a student come to my office afterwards. He was from Wichita, Kansas, a gay gentleman. And I asked him, what are you planning to do after law school? And he said, well, I feel like I have to go somewhere else. And that broke my heart, because I said, now, don't get me wrong, and no offense to anyone from Central Kansas. If you wish to leave Central Kansas, I don't begrudge your choice. But if you want to be in the same place as your family, if you want to be in the same place you grew up in and the same place that you love, I'll be darned if ever people have to say that you need to move, to feel acceptance, to feel safe, and to be comfortable as who you are. And I think that's the work that we are doing in Kansas City each and every day. And I have appreciated partners, not unlike this church, the KC Current, and so many others who have made that an important point here in Kansas City. Another area of acceptance that I think is vital and is something that in current American politics we don't spend enough time discussing is acceptance and welcoming of our immigrant populations. When you look at our immigrant populations around the country, they are not talking points. They're not people to throw on planes or buses to make political points. And I don't often speak about leaders in other states or all those sorts of things, and I don't like to get into it. But shame on people like Governor Greg Abbott of Texas. Shame on people like Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida, who exploit families, children, mothers, fathers, who are coming to America for a better way of life, who are coming to work and who are trying to support families. A conversation that I've had, and this, Joe, may be breaking news, is with other mayors around the country, in New York, in Chicago, and in Denver, who find themselves facing the entry of thousands and thousands of new American communities. And what we've said in Kansas City is that we're here to help. We don't have all the housing in the world, we don't have all the social services in the world, and they take a lot of help. But I've talked to organizations like Jewish Vocational Services, like Della Lamb, and I called them actually a few months ago and said, you know, if we got a few hundred more people who need housing, people who are finding themselves on the streets of the cold of Chicago or New York or Denver, is there something we can do? And instead of saying, oh, we need money and we need everything under the sun, those organizations said, we're here to help. Volunteers said, we're here to help. And donors said, we are here to help because that is what God put us here for. We will be announcing in the weeks and months ahead more efforts from the government in Kansas City to make sure that we can help people, not just those who are here, but also those who need that great beacon of hope to come to a place like Kansas City, to be able to come to a Kansas City but have resources and support. Because no matter what you have faced elsewhere in the world, I think it is vital that we say, we are here to help you find that stability, help find that education for your young people, help find that way of life that is so important to you, being able to have a better and more positive and opportunistic life. When I think about that, I don't think about immigrants or those from other countries as different. I think about my own life story sometimes, and you've heard parts of it, and perhaps I've used it in speeches here before. But I was born the third of three, of course, at Truman Medical Center in Kansas City. My mother dealt with homelessness in her own upbringing, and we dealt with homelessness when I was coming up. And I was incredibly blessed because I had a community that cared. I didn't have a community that said, well, his mom needs to figure it out. I didn't have a community that just said it was an issue of another part of town. It's an issue for another set of people. I had people who said, how can I mentor that young man? How can I help him find educational opportunities? How can I help that family? And to me, what I think is that's what great cities and great communities do. And Kansas City will continue to be a part of it. As we think about mentorship, another place where we need to think of solutions long term is how do we help our young people? How do we help them know that there is great value in each of their lives? This year, many of us talked about, thought about, or in conversations about gun violence after the Chiefs parade. And that was indeed a tragedy, and my heart continues to break, not just for the woman who lost her life and her family, but from so many others who were injured. But the thing that stops you in your tracks, in this job and in our lives, is when you think about how many Kansas Cityans are impacted by gun violence every year. Last year in Kansas City, we had in excess of 180 persons who were murdered. We had more than 550 people who were shot. When you start to think about those numbers, there are parts of our community where every single person knows someone who has been a victim to gun violence. In the last year, I had the misfortune of going to a funeral for a 17-year-old girl from South Kansas City. The funeral was in Grandview. The woman was a talented student at Grandview High School, and she found herself in an abusive relationship. She was 17. Her partner was roughly 19 years old. She found herself in that rough relationship. But as I thought about all with which she dealt, it got me thinking about both our young girls and our young boys. First on our young girls. We spend a lot of time thinking about boys and men and what we can do and all of the issues that boys create. And being a father of a boy, I'm starting to understand it. But what we don't do enough is think about how can we build life and opportunities for more of our young girls. I spoke to a group of 8th grade girls not long ago, all from inner city schools. And I asked them, what do you want to do in life? Where do you want to be? And in so many rooms, we haven't taught our young people hope. We haven't taken the time to tell them any of these careers that you have heard of are opportunities for you. You can be that physician, that teacher, that lawyer, what have you, that mayor if you wish. And all of those opportunities exist in Kansas City. For so many of them, the reality of Kansas City that they knew were the blocks that they were exposed to each and every day. That's why we are doing more work at the city, working with nonprofit partners, the health department, and the faith community to make sure that we are working on a program by the name of Working on Womanhood. The idea is to say not just that we're coming through for one day to say, hey, here's one prominent person, be like her, but instead to say each and every day in small groups at high schools like Southeast and Ruskin and Central and more, that we are here to listen to you. We're here to listen to what you're dealing with. We're here to have honest and open conversations about things that impact young women, from sexual interaction to abuse in relationships, familial issues, homelessness, drugs, and so many more. We are not going to allow our girls and our young women to be afterthoughts in terms of how we're building our city and our society for the future. And I am proud of so many women who are stepping up, both at the city and beyond, to make sure that we are having more of that conversation. For our young boys and our young men, there is much work to do. I had a colleague when I was running for mayor. She was also running for mayor, and I served with her on city council. And she said, it is always much easier to build up men, to build boys into strong men, than it is to actually try to reshape and rebuild broken men already. And so what we are trying to do is to make sure that from a very young age, we are saying that somebody is there and somebody cares about you. Years ago, when I was a city councilman, I was visiting with a pastor who preached just off of 27th and Prospect. And he was saying that he had a young man run into his church who had been involved in a shootout. There was a roving shootout down the streets, and one was looking for refuge. The first thing that may surprise you or may not is that it's not a rarity in Kansas City, which is such a heartbreak. These shootouts of people driving at each other and shooting, running places and shooting, those sorts of things we see every day. But the preacher, being a good Baptist preacher, tried to pray for the young man and was saying, young man, what are you looking to do in your life? What do you think is next for you? And the young man didn't really say anything. He said, I don't plan to be alive by the time I'm 25. Or maybe I'll be in jail, or maybe I'll be somewhere else. We have got to make sure that every conversation about economic development in our city is a conversation about opportunities, jobs, careers, rebuilding, and investment in our young people in the core of our community. If you think about the conversation we just had about stadiums, and there were many things that were awry with that conversation, but you know the thing that irks me the most, the thing that bothers me the most, Arrowhead Stadium is actually in East Kansas City. We may not think about it, we may not talk about it that much, but it sits in East Kansas City. Did you hear a word of conversation about East Kansas City? About the fact that there is a way that even if we are investing in things there, we need to make sure that we're invested in neighborhoods that hundreds of thousands of people drive by on the way to games each year? When we talk about all types of things, and I'm excited about a new Google data center up north, that's $1 billion. I'm excited about hundreds of millions of dollars investment around the city. That's the sort of thing that mayors do. But what we don't do enough is link, how are those jobs getting to communities that need them each and every day in Kansas City? How are we making sure that when we build a new Cerner, now Oracle campus in East Kansas City and Southeast Kansas City, that the largest tax increment financing incentive in the history of Missouri isn't just helping to build a few office buildings that sit in lots of secured space that you and I can't actually drive to visit, but instead actually are doing things like helping our kids in Hickman Mills and at Ruskin High School and all of the kids that will drive by and wonder for years, what is over there? Is that for me? What we can't keep doing is saying, no, it's not. This isn't something for you. This is something for people from far away. What we need to say is, what we need to finally understand is that this all connects. The heartbreak of this job sometimes is that people act like challenges are just these uniquely siloed places. That violent crime is an issue that just exists because there are some bad kids in the world who become bad adults. that they don't think about that if we can build up people and give them opportunities and work to ensure that in our schools every child has the support they need, then we will continue to deal with issues and challenges long after. I remember being a 12-year-old and experiencing homelessness and living at the Crown Lodge Motel off of 350 Highway in Blue Ridge. And I remember that when I was there with my sisters and my mom in a one-bedroom motel room, doing essays, middle school essays, in the bathroom at about 3 o'clock in the morning, because that was the time I could get some peace. And I think about the challenge that so many kids who are dealing with those same things face today. It is not easy to excel and to succeed when you face those types of challenges regularly. And what we need to understand is how homelessness, is how food insecurity, is how lack of familial support in so many situations lead to the very real consequences that we face. And as we have conversations in Kansas City over the next year, I beg of you, the people who are actually in the rooms, and frankly, the people who are our voters, to force us to answer those questions of how do we actually help break cycles of violence and challenges in our community. Because, my friends, the elections where you say, hey, who's looking at the holistic picture, don't end with last Tuesday's election. You are likely to hear a conversation about a new jail for Kansas City. Now, I won't get too into the politics, although they can be frustrating sometimes. You might have also heard Jackson County is also building a new jail. So you'll get a Jackson County jail for $300 million. You can get a Kansas City jail for $250 million. So this year in Kansas City, Jackson County, we can spend $500 million on jails. Maybe useful, maybe not. But when you think about spending those sorts of resources on those two different facilities, it makes you ask, well, can we spend $500 million on some other things? On upkeep of our schools, on faculty salaries for our teachers, on counselors for young people? And can we spend that type of money once and for all on mental health in our communities? You know, one of the most frustrating things for me as a person, and I'm not just a mayor here, but I serve as chair of the Criminal Justice Committee of the United States Conference of Mayors. So I visit with other mayors after every mass shooting, after every incident, and we're all used to it. It's almost like a script. We're after a shooting, people will say any number of things, and then politicians who aren't interested in change say almost nothing other than, mental health. But then when you actually ask our friends in the Missouri legislature or the governor of Missouri or our friends over in Kansas, what new investments are you making in mental health? They don't really have much to say. It's a few $1 million here or there. Here in Kansas City, we are about to get a new mental health facility, long overdue, and I commend them for that. But I think what we need to actually say is, how do we integrate that in everyday care for people? If you are growing up in a community where trauma is impacting you, where you've had parents who have been murdered, where you have a friend, and we hear this every year. We hear this every year on the news, right at the start of the school year. There's an elementary school-age child who loses their life to violence. How hard is it to sit in a third-grade classroom where your neighbor has been murdered? And we ask these kids to just adapt, to move on, to cope, and then go on and be productive folks thereafter. We have got to do that investment more than anything in the future of Kansas City, Jackson County, and this entire region. And so do I have hope? Absolutely I have hope. I have hope because I visit classrooms all the time. There is nothing more uplifting, because if you go to an elementary classroom in almost any part of this city, and I've had the fortune of doing that, you have this bright set of happy young people who want to be read to, who want to interact with you, who actually want to give you a hug. And that's almost everywhere. The most important thing I can do with my remaining time as mayor, and that I would hope you ask of every person and public servant who comes through here, is how do they make those better life outcomes for those young people along the way? There is nothing more important than we can do. We can have all the fanciest facilities. We can have 8 new stadiums. Who knows? We can have everything under the sun. But if we're not addressing those core issues, we will never be the community that we need to be, that we can truly be proud of. We can never be the community that actually is that place that's exciting, that's thrilling, that is bringing new people in, that's attracting folks to the future of Kansas City. And so what I ask of you for our next year, yes, we'll open streetcar up. Yes, we'll continue to celebrate an outstanding women's soccer stadium. Yes, my friends, regrettably or not, baseball and football will continue to take up all the attention. But more than anything, I hope that in each of those conversations we are asking ourselves, how is this helping our community for the future by helping our young people in our community? There is nothing more vital in terms of what we can do. So I thank you all for investing in Kansas City, for giving a Sunday morning to talk about civic affairs. I occasionally have back and forths with the Kansas City Star editorial board, which is never productive. They tell you not to battle people who buy ink by the barrel. But nonetheless, one of those things that I often ask them about is this: help us cover those efforts that are working on things like mental health. Help us share how we are in more high schools, how there are more opportunities for people. In a society where kids are watching TikTok, where parents are watching something else, and where it's very hard sometimes to even know what's going on, let's make sure we share that there are people in Kansas City who care about the substance. There are people in Kansas City who care about access to health care. There are people in Kansas City who care about getting assault weapons off of the streets of Kansas City and throughout Missouri. And more than anything, there are people in Kansas City who care about kids like I was years ago, who just need a little bit of an opportunity and could do anything in the world if you help them get there. God bless you all. Thank you, and thank you for listening to me this morning.
Yes, so we will be getting to our question and answer period. Thank you. That's Kansas City Mayor Quinton Lucas, always so gracious to come here every year. And so we will start the question and answer period, but first we will take a pause here to have a collection to support this programming. You can also give online by going to allsoulskc.org and pulling down on you hitting the blue donate button and then finding on the form in the drop-down menu. So we appreciate all the support that you can give. And I also want to tell you about our forum coming next Sunday. The American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, will be here. The Missouri Executive Director, Luz Maria Enriquez, and the Director of Integrated Advocacy, Tony Rothert, with the ACLU, they will be here to talk about advancing social justice by securing constitutional rights. So you want to be here for that. All right, so yeah, to ask the questions, come down here to this microphone. And it's very important that we get to questions, avoid statements. Please get to a quick question so we can get back to the mayor, and also one question each until everyone's had an opportunity. All right, so I think we're ready. We have our first question.
Good morning. My name is Anita. I'm asking you, how can we get involved? I mean, is this, you're saying we need to do this, we need to do this. And I know there's some community efforts like Mothers Demand Action, there's community groups. How can we, what's the plan? Is there a structure in place? Is there a plan to get a structure in place for people like us who may want to help, but we don't know where to go? I mean, do we need to just let it happen in the community, like groups like Mothers Demand Action, or is there, you know, something from the city that would put out a plan or a, you know what I mean?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I appreciate the question, because I think that's the greatest bit of frustration that most of us have. I do usually look to and recommend just a few programs that are very accessible, but I will take your question and probably go back and work on how can someone who hears about an issue, hears about a shooting on the plaza, knows teenagers are involved, says, I can do something about it. On the young people and mentorship, there's an organization by the name of Lead to Read, which I think is Lead to Read, which is one of the best ways I think that folks can actually get into a classroom. You build a relationship with a young person. You're consistently reading with them, going to volunteer with some regularity, connecting with it. And I think that's something that allows you to be active. It's not asking for money. It's not asking you to get on a bus to Jefferson City to try to address the issue. But, you know, I think the other side of it, and that's really the organization I recommend, the other side of it, though, in every campaign, whether issues or a candidate-based campaign, is to actually ask people about it. I'll give you a quick anecdote that tells you everything that's perhaps wrong with American politics. When I ran for city council in 2015, and I had a campaign manager, fascinating man, now deceased, Patrick Gray. And I sat down with Pat at his political consulting headquarters, and I said I'd like to run for city council. He was a chain smoker, big drinker, and he said, politics lost all of its passion when Bobby Kennedy died. And I said, well, it's been a few years, so I hope you don't have that pessimism. But nonetheless, and then I came up with a list of issues I cared about. He said, no, don't say all that. He said, we're going to put a mailer out that says, Quinton Lucas, right? Better roads, better jobs, better city. I said, Pat, what does that mean? And he's like, it doesn't have to mean anything. And I think if you saw weaknesses of the last race, the Tuesday election, on the county sales tax, where the mailers, and I got them and you got them, they just kind of said, vote yes for such and such, and you saw that sort of narrative, I think that is such a problem. For me, it actually does inspire change when we get a chance to question officials on, let's say, a mass shooting. Why is it that we have laws in Missouri that allow for the easy accessibility of high-capacity firearms for our young people? To ask that, and ask that question to people who maybe don't even oversee it. A city council member should start to at least be thinking about it. And why does it matter if they do? Well, we pay tons of money, Kansas City, Missouri does, for lobbyists each year in the Missouri General Assembly. And if you don't ask us about it, then we don't tell our lobbyists about that. And the only issues that we are pushing in Kansas City and Jefferson City are things like, well, the Royals may want a new stadium, so does the state have $300 million for it? Right? That's what becomes successes and failures in the Missouri legislature. So I would want you to continue to push in the next city council race, in your state representative races and others. And the challenge is with where we live, where you live, they may agree with you. But nonetheless, it is making sure that we share that we are not giving up on those important issues. And so I would say that it is both organizations, Lead to Read. I do find Mom's Demand to be useful, but nonetheless, I do like organizations where I can get involved. The Working on Womanhood is another group that you can look up that is investing in more of our public schools, but then also making sure that you actually challenge people. Because I'll make one final point on guns. The Chiefs Super Bowl parade shooting, and I think all of this is public now. Perhaps the most heartbreaking point of all is that your defendants, your shooters, are 18, 22, which is not actually that old, 16, 16, and we're still kind of thinking there may be some other teenagers involved. Question one, how do they get AR-15s, the equivalent of AR-15s? How are they getting modified handguns that turn them into fully automatic weapons? And why aren't we doing more to make sure that we're intervening not just in helping them make better choices as young people, but in the same way that when I was growing up, right, we had laws about underage drinking and all of that, and they're breaking up parties and that sort of thing. We need to make sure that we have tools that are available to the police and others to get guns out of the hands of our young people. And when you live in a state that just says, basically, here you go, everything's fine, then that's how you have kids walking around with backpacks and AR-15s. It is unconscionable to me, and I don't think that there is any sane person who, if you actually put a question to them, would actually say, oh yeah, that makes sense. And I think that we can make leeway there. I once had a conversation with Governor Mike Parson on that very topic about, don't we all not like having guns in the hands of convicted domestic abusers? And he said, oh yeah, well, we don't want that situation going on. And so I'm like, exactly. If we don't want that situation going on, however you define it, isn't there something we can do? And that's the push that I think we need to keep doing. I've learned something from the anti-abortion movement, actually, right? For generations. They were out there. I actually lived in Hutchinson, Kansas during the 1991 Summer of Mercy, which was in Wichita, when all the anti-abortion activists went to Wichita. They tried to close down George Tiller's clinic. They shot him the first time, right? And it seemed like they were folks who were just these extremists until we fast forward 30 years later and they accomplished their goal. I would hope that whatever your goals may be, that we say it is not a fait accompli, that we will always be awash in firearms such that we have to be afraid of being in any venue ever. That is a world that I don't think we should live with, and I think that requires us to continue to push every public servant who comes our way. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. I'm I'm a big fan of evidence-based public policy.
Yes.
And when it comes to criminal justice policies, for example, the research that I've seen says that criminal justice policies are driven by people's perceptions of crime and have little to do with crime itself. Your comment?
So the answer to that question is absolutely yes, and you can see that in a number of American cities, ours being somewhat distinctly different, unfortunately. But generally, in major American cities, you are seeing a decline in things like homicides and non-fatal shootings. However, if you were to watch Fox News channel right now, right, you would see a very different point. Be afraid of America's cities, right? If you go into an American city, everything is awry, they are a mess. Liberal policies in cities are literally killing you. That's a quote, by the way, from President Trump near the end of his term. His 2020 effort was basically just to, in my view, scare everyone in connection with that. You know, so I think that there are a few things that we need to do to address it. One, I abhor, and Republicans and Democratic politicians fall prey to this, which is to fall into the rhetoric. You're seeing that a lot right now with immigrants, and I've been disappointed because there are some mayors, Democratic mayors in our country, who are saying the immigrants are destroying our city. The character of New York City will be destroyed if immigrants are here. New York City, right? I mean, that's kind of, you know, it's not like accents or new people or anything are new. And so you see that both in the immigration conversation and in the public safety conversation. We need to have a realistic conversation on what the solutions are to public safety. If I mentioned to you, for example, we just talked about the Chiefs Parade. If you have two 16-year-old shooters, then there is this viewpoint of the world that if only we had criminal penalties like we did in the 1950s, you know, if only we had thrown away the key, right, we put all these people in state penitentiaries and all of that early, then it would solve everything. Let me tell you something. Even in 1950, a 16-year-old wasn't already in a state penitentiary. And so clearly there is something else that we need to do. There is just this view of the world that is in too many situations frozen, that, you know, you should just be scared. There's this bad guy that usually looks a certain way, right? And there's just this element of which we should be afraid. And so much of our media conversation traffics on that fear. You know, on your point, and the way we do it, I think, is sharing better messaging, creating more forums where we can actually have conversation like this. But sometimes it's even on shows and programs I like. When I was growing up, I've always been into Sunday morning political shows. But if you had looked at them even, and I'm not the oldest man, if you look at them just 25 years ago, you would usually have a long interview with a public official. They would actually talk about something like Social Security reform, which we don't even talk about anymore, right? And you would get to know whomever the character was. If you turn on even those today, which are our thoughtful conversations, it's talking point person for like 3 minutes. It then is video of Be Scared of This City. It's a panel, a round table of people that kind of shout at each other, and then we just move along thereafter. We have got to get back to an area and a world where we have more forums, where we could talk about real evidence, where we can have the challenging of ideas, where we can admit we're wrong and right in certain ways, and where fundamentally we actually aren't just trying to feed red meat to the lions all the time. And I think the problem is that is exactly where we are. I am very concerned about this next presidential race because I think we are going to see even more of that. That is the nature these days, I think particularly of our political right. And so my only hope is that we're able to get more truth and information out.
I appreciate your comments on gun violence. That is a primary concern for me.
Yes,
but my question is going to sound rather petty in light of that.
That's all right.
So I live in the Northland. I appreciate your nod to the Northland. Appreciate the recycling bins that we have.
Yep.
Are there any plans for trash bins? Because we put our trash out,
Yep.
and then the dogs come and the wildlife come, and we come home and it's scattered all over
Right.
the place.
I always love a good basic city services question that I can answer. You are getting trash bins that are just like the recycling bins this summer, so they're coming. And to tell you, that means Kansas City government is delivering 170,000 trash bins. Last time we started in the Northland on recycling bins. I don't know where we plan to start yet, but those will be all around the city. Part of our whole program to try to address trash broadly in our city. There's too much. We're also addressing illegal dumping, and so that's coming very soon. By at the latest September, you should have your trash bin.
Part two of that question is this morning's article about the potential landfill in the state having an issue with it. Is it too early to start planning on issues with solid waste and what to do with it?
So on the landfill and solid waste, your question very much is related to the last one, which is that the more we throw in our trash bins, the more we have to worry about putting out at some point. So there are a few things Kansas City's trying to do to address it. One, we are trying to build up a composting program. So much of your household waste is actually food and so many other issues which we can do different things with. And so that's a large part of what we're trying to do. Recycling, there's a reason, there's actually a theory to having the recycling bins released first. We want people to get used to that. We want them doing recycling and that type of work. And then on trash itself, we're continuing to hope that people don't release all the trash in the world, but instead try to find ways to conserve, among other issues. My long-term interest in landfills is not to have them in Kansas City proper. I'm not a big landfill guy to try to find other remedies to waste. And so I think, at least as to the issue on the southern border of our city, I expect that not to come to fruition, that landfill. And I hope that the whole region is looking at ways that we can reduce our usage and the waste we're putting out.
I'm gonna give you a quick question here. Now, you talk about your background and how your connection to the working class, the people. Now, there haven't been at times, though, some contentious relationships with the KC tenants and the wage folks. And so where do you describe that relationship and how you're trying to work with them and where you think that's going to be going?
Yeah. So something I've learned, and I learned this from educators, actually, right? Before you're in the position, you think you are a cool, relatable person. And then once you're the principal or the teacher, you're kind of on the other side. And occasionally with my friends in the activist community, I feel that, right? The position of mayor is not one where, if you're doing it right, in my opinion, you're the aggressive guy who's saying, yeah, let's march on City Hall and burn it down, right? You're not quite that guy. I've known a few over the years. On every city council, there's always one. But you don't want all of them to be it. So, I would say this about the relationships, and I may go on a bit of a tangent here, so hopefully nobody's in a rush this morning. I've always tried to make sure I listen. I think they understand my story. I think they understand that to the extent we have a difference of opinion, it's more of a difference in methods than it is a difference in values. And I'll give a few examples. During 2020 and the protests, I made an offer to meet with a group of folks by the name of One Struggle KC. Their efforts are largely Black Lives Matter type issues. And I sat with them. It's always the hottest day ever whenever you agree to meet with a large group of people who are angry at you. But we met outside, and we talked about a few things. State control of the police department, which I too believe is a travesty. Other issues as it relates to safety in our city. And, it started off tense, very tense. And I think what I usually try to do to get through that conversation is to say just very much, I'm going to give you my honest thoughts. You want what I'm honestly sharing, and maybe we disagree, but I understand that you have a way to push things too. I had the chance to speak to a national convening of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, which was fascinating to me, because that was a whole group of lawyers who say kind of in their policy, we are here to push change, to agitate in all of these places. And if you are government, that means often you will be the defendant. That means you will be the party that has to stand up and rationalize something, and that's just part of how it goes. And so I have learned early in life never to take it personally, never to take it as anything more than these people care. And I'll say one other person who taught me that lesson there was a city councilwoman by the name of Carol Coe, who you may or may not remember. She was a colorful character. And when I came on the scene in politics, Carol was nearer to the end of her life, but she would still show up at different community events, the Black Agenda Group and some others. And, and one day I'm at a forum, and she used profanity, which I won't use in church, but she said, boy, you ain't nothing, but I like you. Councilwoman, what does that mean? But, and I remember I left that meeting and, I went off and got a good law degree and I did all this, and you could just spend time being in your feelings. I was just like, how dare she talk to, I've done this, that, and the other, and I'm really important and all of that. Something that our Royals friends are dealing with right now. But nonetheless, right, you can just think, I'm special. And if you go that way, you miss the point and you miss why they're agitating. You miss the years and years in which she and others had to fight for a voice. Maybe not the way I would have done it, maybe sometimes not productive to your end goal. But the reason that the KC tenants are protesting landlords, the reason the KC tenants are saying we want to make sure there's affordable rent is because of the first part of my story, we haven't had it. There was no one standing up for it. And so I will disagree mightily sometimes with the methods, but I never disagree with the values. And if I may tangent point too, and I thought about it for today, I like perhaps many of you, and I mentioned Gaza briefly during our speech, I think like many Americans, I'm having a difficult time with how we are as a country prosecuting our support of the conflict there and just the colossal loss of life and the undervaluing, in my opinion, of Palestinian lives. And I'm a fan of this president and likely will vote for him, but I would hope that as we see just more tragedies each day, and again, and I grieved for the people who both lost their lives and were impacted in Israel on October the 7th, but I would hope that long term we find some way as a country, and I would hope our federal government finds some way to make sure that we are acknowledging the harms that are being done to entire populations and try to find some way to solve it. And the reason I raise it with the point you just made is, I say God bless any organization that's trying to spotlight a way to make life better for other humans. And, I'll continue to think that. And maybe after I'm done being a mayor, I'll join the more activist group of marching on City Hall or something like that. Yes.
Good morning, Mayor.
Good morning.
So I help a lady in North Kansas City who's had a double stroke. She's now wheelchair bound. And there's a lot of times where she likes to get out into the city. And one of the biggest things that I find is difficult for her is when we need a restroom, there's not one available. And I know that San Francisco has had optional to have attendant toilets put on the streets. Is that something Kansas City's looking to get?
That's interesting. That is something I will admit that I have not considered. However, it's something that's certainly worthy of consideration. We have seen much progress since 1991 with the Americans with Disabilities Act, at least creating more access in our venues, but largely only public ones, where that doesn't solve the challenge that is faced in so many broader areas. Underlying more of your question, which is something we don't do enough, but we thought about during COVID, to what extent do we even have public restroom facilities available for people? Right. And shouldn't we? And there are more and more right. People who are mature, yeah, who like to get outside, they like to exercise, walk, right, and there's nothing. Right. And I think we need to change, not unlike, and I'm not familiar with the San Francisco approach, I am familiar with the Paris approach from reading about it, the same, where it is not something that is impossible. It is not something that throws off society to create those opportunities for folks. And I would actually like to evaluate that, because what we did at best, which was not best, was in 2020 during the pandemic, city government put up a few portable restroom units that were not ADA accessible at all, and called it a day. And so I would think that more permanent environments where we have that sort of accessibility in commercial spaces too, it can't just be in the middle of Swope Park only, is actually important and vital. And so I thank you for bringing that up, and that's something that well, I'm glad you came here for it. I can catch everything here.
Well, we have a YouTube audience question that I don't necessarily agree with, but I'm going to have to ask it. As a person who has zero interest in football and baseball, why should I and someone like me ask to be paid for a stadium instead of patrons paying higher ticket prices?
Okay, so that's a very relevant topic right now. So there are a few different ways to cut it, and I think the current stadium conversation is and Dave Helling in the Kansas City Star, who once retired but keeps unretiring, I think sometimes it's just to antagonize me, but he writes in a piece, and I agree with this point. I think there are a lot of different ways in this election that people think people voted. Some think it's because it was the crossroads, some think because of corporate welfare, some think because of the chief's plan and perhaps lack of innovation in connection with it. I think that it's frankly all of the above, but I think the electorate these days is split, if not in thirds, even something more strident than it, which is, I think there's a substantial number of people in our society who wonder why we would ever fund private enterprise to such a level. And I think that's probably at least a 40% or so viewpoint in Kansas City and Jackson County today. I think that there's probably still a majority viewpoint that would, but wants them to have a plan to get it right, to be responsible with the discussion. In terms of those who believe, and I here won't necessarily argue with those who say we really shouldn't. There are a few reasons that you invest in venues. One reason to invest in venues, and that's why I speak on venues rather than the teams themselves. In venues, you do get events, you do get further economic activity thereafter. So you may not like football, but perhaps you like the economic activity that follows a Taylor Swift concert or a Beyonce concert or Stevie Nicks or all those things that were here last year. That is generally a positive for Kansas City, and economic development activity relating thereto is perhaps why we do them. It's why we have a T-Mobile Center. I think the other reason that you do have that investment, and this is a big conversation on college campuses, and I don't pretend to answer it because my exit man has stood up, but nonetheless, I still teach at the University of Kansas. I had a professor, friend of mine, he's since passed away, but he was not a big fan of Division I college athletics. And actually, it's very interesting. I had an office at the University of Kansas Law School, which is across the street from Allen Fieldhouse, the basketball arena. Recently, I lost my office, and many others did, because they have moved the School of Social Work at the University of Kansas into the law school because there's no longer a home for social work. And it's just this disjointed world for me, because what that suggests to me is the state of Kansas will produce fewer social workers. Vital, right? School counselors, all of that. But we only see budgets for athletics continue to increase. The university would likely answer by saying, well, it's our brand and people want to come to KU for this, and that's what we're here for. I think I push the question back to you. Does a state university exist to train social workers and school teachers and others for the people? Does it exist to have teams that build pride for a community? Do the teams that build pride for the community, is that the only way you can fund the social workers, even though, as we all know, Division I athletics largely just funds itself, and many programs run a deficit? And I think what you saw in the last stadium vote was a city and a county and a community dealing with that same question of what?
All right. Mayor Quinton Lucas, Kansas City, thank you so much for being here. Just a reminder, we have a church service here in about 15 minutes. Everyone's welcome to stay for that. And again, thank you, Mayor. It's always a pleasure.